You could almost see the truck waiting, ready to drag that old boat away like it was nothing more than junk. The family, still raw from losing their grandfather, saw it as one more burden piled onto their grief. Clearing it out seemed practical, necessary, final. But here's the thing. Just as the boat was about to disappear, a neighbor showed up. In his hands was a manila envelope. Inside, papers that would upend everything they thought they knew. Turns out, this wasn't just about a rusted boat. Stay with me for the full story, because what came next changed how they remembered their grandfather, and how they measured loss itself. This is where the weight of empty spaces sets in. The dock was still there, but it felt hollow without him. Standing on those worn planks, the family noticed what was missing more than what remained. The water moved the same as always, but the silence was different, sharper, heavier. Back at the house, stacks of unopened mail lay waiting. Property tax forms, bank notices, quiet reminders that the world doesn't pause for grief. Every envelope pulled their focus back toward money, deadlines, and hard choices. Keeping the place wasn't possible, not without sinking under the weight of bills. And then there was the boat. It sat tied at the dock, rust flaking from its hull like tired skin. The paint wore thin, peeling back to wood that felt as old as the family itself. From a distance, it looked more like a shadow of what it once had been than something usable. Each person in the family saw it with different eyes. To one, it was another line item, one more problem to fix. To another, it was simply clutter that slowed the process of selling. Not once did anyone look at it and see possibility. No one had the time to search for meaning in its slow decay. Neighbors visited, setting down casseroles and condolences. Their words softened the moment, but their glances toward the dock said something else. One of them muttered it outright. "You should haul that out. It's just scrap." Another pointed out how prices for old metal could bring in quick cash. Practical, yes. But it stung to hear the boat's end written off so easily. And here's where the urgency sharpened. Taxes didn't care about legacy. The bank didn't weigh memories. Every conversation circled back to numbers and dates on forms. Nostalgia had no place when survival pressed down. You can picture it. The mix of sadness and deadlines crushing in at the same time. Each choice felt rushed, each goodbye cut short. Grief was already hard. Now it carried layers of pressure that left no room to breathe. If it were you, standing in your own family's place, with bills stacked high and a worn piece of history in the way, what would you do? Would you keep it, or would you let it go to the scrapyard? The family chose what seemed most reasonable. The dock went up for sale. The boat would stay tied, left for the new owners to deal with. With signatures on the papers, they walked away convinced it was the only path forward. Their shoulders lightened, but only on the surface. And yet, that boat wasn't so empty. What looked like forgotten wood and rusted steel held something no one had paused to see. That's the risk of empty spaces. They often carry more than silence. Because sometimes, what feels like clutter is holding the very heart of a story. And to understand why that boat mattered at all, you have to look back at the life of the man who cared for it every single day. Think about why someone hangs on to an object long after it's worn down. For the grandfather, the boat wasn't just a thing. It was woven into his life. Each morning before the sun broke, he walked the same path down the dock. He'd run a hand along the rail, check the hull, or simply rest in the captain's chair with his coffee. These weren't chores. They were quiet rituals, a way of grounding himself before the day began. On its deck, he mended nets, his fingers steady from years of practice. He knew every knot and patch, every board that groaned underfoot, the way the water line shifted after heavy rain. The boat was a tool, yes, but more than that, it was his refuge. When the house felt noisy or life pressed in too tightly, this was where he came to breathe. If you flip through the family's old photo albums, you see different scenes. The boat, polished and gleaming with fresh paint. Piles of silver fish spilling across the deck. Clusters of men laughing, leaning on each other's shoulders. In the middle, the grandfather stands steady and sure, his face unmistakably proud. You can almost hear the voices rising above the gulls, the rhythm of a community tied to tides and to each other. He sometimes hinted at special rites, using phrases like grandfathered in when he spoke about certain waters. But he never gave details, never set aside time to explain. Maybe he assumed someone already understood, or maybe the words were too ordinary for him to realize their weight. Those hints blurred into the background, like the sound of waves, noted but never questioned. Meanwhile, for the rest of the family, the boat faded into scenery. Their memories tied more to the dock itself. Birthday parties with picnic tables, cannonball dives into the shallows, sunsets dripping gold across the water. The boat was always there, but as background, not center stage. To them it became like a tree in the yard, familiar but barely noticed. This is how stories slip. One generation believes the meaning is obvious, the next only sees the surface. Over time, the object survives, but the story doesn't travel with it. What becomes a ritual for one person turns into clutter for another. And without translation, the deeper meaning is lost. When the grandfather passed, only fragments of his knowledge remained. The boat was left as a shell of itself, covered in rust and peeling paint, while the history tied to it dissolved in silence. The family saw an old vessel without value. What they didn't see were the rites hinted at, the history tangled in nets and tied, the identity pressed deep within its worn boards. That gap in understanding cut deeper than they realized. It almost stripped the boat of its worth, made a legacy vanish into the noise of debts and deadlines. Because when you don't know what something is, you can't judge what it's worth. But here's what lingers in the shadows. Not everything was forgotten. While the family looked away, someone else remembered, and that memory would soon collide with the harsh math of practical decisions. The first cut of loss doesn't always come at the funeral. Sometimes it arrives later, with a clipboard and a pen, when memory collides with money. That's what happened as the property sale began to move forward. Buyers stepped onto the dock with eyes tuned only to measurements, depth of the waterline, the stability of pilings, usable square footage, practical details, numbers that could be circled, compared, negotiated. They didn't ask about summer evenings spent fishing, or which child learned patience holding a line there. To them, history metered out in inches and concrete. Then their eyes locked on the boat. And there, the tone changed. One buyer gestured sharply toward it and said, "That goes." To them, it wasn't a relic worth holding. It was an eyesore, a potential risk. Old metal, faded wood, nothing more. In their view, it belonged not on the water, but in a scrapyard. This struck a nerve inside the family. Some felt an ache about letting it go. It was his boat, grandfather's. One of them whispered during dinner, "It's like losing him twice." But across the table, others saw only bulk and cost. They looked at it as dead weight, storage fees, labor to move it, the endless question of who would keep hauling responsibility tied to a rotting hull. Arguments carried across quiet phone calls and tense late nights. Not shouting, but worn fatigue. The kind that comes from reopening a wound no one wants to touch. Each mention of the boat added another layer of pressure, as if grief itself was being measured in dollars and disposal plans. Choosing between what feels right and what makes sense is rarely clean. You might know the safer option, but your heart lingers with the harder one. That was the divide. Sentiment crashed against practicality, and in the middle sat the weight of exhaustion. To the buyers, the logic felt straightforward. If the family didn't remove the boat, they would handle it. Calling a scrap service, scheduling pickup, it was all just part of the deal. Efficient, no bad intent, just business. For them, this wasn't a shrine to protect, it was an obstacle to clear. And under the drain of grief, the family finally yielded. Keeping the boat felt irrational when stacked against bills and paperwork. The closing loomed, and in that tired space, they let the boat go. Not ceremoniously, just with a nod, a signature, and silence. They were given a short window to have it taken away. Not months, not even several weeks, just a narrow slice of time before the new owners acted themselves. That fragile deadline hung like another weight, pressing everyone toward acceptance without room for second thoughts. In that moment, the calculation was simple. The dock had value, money had urgency, the boat did not. Or at least that was the story told on paper. And so the choice was made, reluctant but final. This was the first cut of loss. Not in the past, not at the graveside, but here, in the cold math of a transaction. It showed how legacy can shrink when judged against the present, how quickly history can be reduced to clutter. What the family didn't realize was that outside their circle, someone else had been watching, quietly, closely. And for him, the boat wasn't clutter at all. Sometimes, the person who carries the core of a story isn't part of the family at all. In this case, it was the neighbor, the man who had spent decades fishing beside the grandfather, sharing tides and storms, long mornings and tired evenings. He wasn't just the man next door. In many ways, he had been the keeper of context, the quiet witness to habits that others barely noticed. He saw the for sale sign planted in the yard. He watched the family hauling boxes, the slump in their shoulders, the way they moved like a clock that had lost its rhythm. Outwardly, he stayed polite, keeping his distance, but his wife could see how restless he became. "It doesn't sit right with him," she told her sister one night. And it showed. He'd spend hours awake, unsettled, haunted by the thought of what was being left behind. What tugged at him wasn't the house, or even the dock. It was the boat. He remembered when they had both gotten theirs, around the same time. The grandfather had lingered over the paperwork, checking each line before signing. While others raced through forms, he was deliberate, steady, treating the documents like they carried more weight than simple registration. That moment stayed with the neighbor. Paperwork wasn't a chore to the grandfather. It was protection. It mattered. Yet now, he saw the family walk past that same boat without pausing. To them, it was background scenery in photographs, or worse, a problem in the way of a sale. From his perspective, though, it was the center, an anchor that carried meaning they hadn't uncovered. Watching them skirt past it as though it was invisible only deepened his unease. So, one evening, unable to settle, he went down into his basement. The space was crowded. Boxes of nets, faded photographs, yellowed letters, and years of receipts. He'd always been the kind who archived every scrap of paper, as if order alone could keep the past from slipping away. He moved past fishing poles stacked in a corner and opened a box marked "Boat Docks" inside. Rows of folders sat in careful order, each one heavy with licensing slips and water-stained envelopes. He pulled one from the bottom, thicker than the rest. Its manila surface was marked in a familiar hand, the grandfather's, with the boat's original name written across it. Underneath, just 2 words, "Just in case." Standing under a bare bulb, dust floating in the still air, the neighbor didn't open it. He didn't need to. He had been holding on to it for decades. Protecting it was the reason the grandfather had passed it to him in the first place. Safekeeping wasn't random. It was intentional. And now, with the family on the edge of losing the boat entirely, this was the moment meant for that envelope. Carrying it upstairs, he brushed away the dust. The choice was clear now. Silence would let the story collapse. Action might restore it. The next morning, he stepped onto the path toward the family's door, envelope in hand. And that's where this story took its sharpest turn. How can a thin envelope carry more weight than an entire boat? That question pressed itself into the moment as the neighbor set the worn folder down on the table. Outside, the grind of a truck engine echoed through the walls, steel against silence. 2 men in heavy gloves moved toward the dock, their steps loud and certain. Inside the house, the kitchen fell quiet. The family had been folding away their lives into boxes, rushing to finish, ready to lock the door behind them. The knock had already felt like an intrusion. And yet, with the envelope resting in front of them, their rhythm broke. One of them told the neighbor they were busy. The truck was here, it could wait. But he didn't leave. His voice stayed level, earnest. "Your grandfather would want you to see this first," he said. "Not later, not tomorrow, now." The hesitation lasted only a moment. The family shifted, making room at the table, clearing a half-packed box so the envelope could take center place. Its manila surface was faintly creased, sealed with an old clasp. The neighbor opened it slowly, pulling free a collection of papers. They weren't scraps or random notes. They were orderly, official-looking documents. Vessel registration forms, a certificate marked with stamps and signatures, folders of records that had clearly been maintained, and in the margins of some sheets, the familiar handwriting of their grandfather, slight calculations, reminders, cryptic notes to himself. The paper had held up, still crisp, as though it had been waiting all this time. At first, the family didn't know what to make of it, but the sight of their grandfather's script was grounding. Everyone drew closer, the tired hurry of moving days suspended as if the clock had paused. Across the room, through the window, movement outside caught their eyes, the scrapmen nearing the dock, but no one rose to meet them. All focus bent toward the stack of papers spread across the table. One sheet in particular drew their attention. It was a title form, heavy in the hand. At the top corner, pressed into the paper, was not the usual print. It carried an unusual maker's mark, something more intricate than they expected to see. It was small, but it glinted with importance, suggesting a detail deeper than a simple fishing vessel thrown together in bulk. That single mark shifted the air in the kitchen. It opened a gap wide enough for doubt, planting a question. What exactly had they been considering scrap? For the first time, the boat felt less like a problem to be solved and more like a mystery to be read. The sound of the idling engine outside grew louder, almost intrusive. One of the family members set the document down, stood up, and looked toward the dock. The urgency had reversed. Stopping the haulers wasn't just an option now, it was necessary. Decisions could wait, but discovery couldn't. Because if an envelope could contain official records and an unusual seal, then the boat standing outside wasn't just an old vessel decaying at the edge of the property. It was something with a past tied to it, piece by piece, word by word. Papers lead to names, and sometimes a name can hold far more than you expect. The first word spoken from those papers was not a number or a stamp. It was a name. Someone read it aloud at the table, and it landed with an unexpected weight. Formal, almost elegant. It sounded unlike the casual nicknames tied to the boat in daily life. It sounded like history reaching back. Then came the pause. Every eye turned toward the window, where the boat sat in plain sight. On its side, beneath peeling paint, the letters of its everyday name were still visible. Simple, personal. The one the grandfather spoke every morning when stepping onto the dock. The names didn't match. The difference opened a question. Why would he alter it? Changing a boat's name can be casual, the way you rename a dog or give a car a pet title. That's what the grandfather seemed to do, something friendly, something his own. But the name inside the documents wasn't chosen like that. It was official. It pointed back to where the boat began. And that suggested it carried meaning deeper than a family nickname. Curiosity led them to check it. A phone in hand, quick search, a few taps. The trail suggested that the name tied back to a small but respected shipyard. Not a large factory line. A builder where detail and purpose carried weight. It didn't prove anything outright, but it was enough to mark the boat as potentially different. Maybe not just another common vessel. Here's why that mattered. A builder's name can signal something one of a kind, designed with the owner in mind instead of churned out for mass use. That hint alone reframed how the family looked at the boat. If it was tied to a builder known for careful work, maybe their grandfather hadn't just purchased an old fishing boat. Maybe he had once ordered it, discussed its structure, given input that shaped how it was built. From there, what once looked like rust and peeling layers felt different. Not neglect, but survival. Marks of age instead of flaws. A vessel shaped with care and then worked for decades, carrying traces of its life in every weathered detail. That shift was subtle, but powerful. Suddenly, the boat wasn't only sentimental. It began to look like a fragment of history, not a prop, not clutter, a crafted tool with a past, one that deserved more than to be carried off as junk. The name had turned it from background to centerpiece. It stood as both memory and artifact. They looked again at the men by the dock. Their view shifted. This wasn't scrap waiting for disposal. This was something that might matter well beyond one family's grief. Something worth protecting until the truth was clearer. And yet, names only tell part of the story. On those same documents, beside that elegant name, ran a quiet sequence of numbers. At first, they seemed like nothing more than identifiers, but as you'll see, those numbers were more than ink on a page. They were codes, ones that could unlock even deeper secrets about the boat's past. On paper, registration numbers can look meaningless, but the truth is they aren't random. They work like markers, clues that tell you where a vessel was registered, when, and sometimes even the conditions tied to that approval. Sitting at the table, the family had one of those numbers right there in front of them. Just a mix of letters and digits. At first glance, nothing unusual. They began simply enough. One relative typed the combination into a state website for boat registrations. The page spun, loaded, and came up empty. No record. They tried again, double-checking each character, swapping a few to see if it was copied wrong. Still nothing. It seemed as though the boat had no digital footprint at all, almost like it had never existed in the system. That mismatch created unease. The papers in their hands looked official, stamped, complete. But the database drew a blank. Had the record disappeared? Had time erased proof of what these papers claimed? The neighbor, calm but firm, reminded them that not all records are updated online. Some older vessels, he explained, could still be documented only in archives. If the boat had been registered decades earlier, the details might rest in files never converted to digital. What he was really saying was this: sometimes the proof isn't gone. It's just stored differently. You can think of it like an attic box, not lost, just waiting to be reopened. So the family reached past the digital dead ends and called an office directly. A clerk on the other end acknowledged the number and suggested that older records, the kind from past generations, were usually held in physical form. Some could carry details that newer databases didn't. One family member decided to follow this path. A visit brought them face-to-face with paper files and archival documents. Among rows of aging folders, they found it. Their grandfather's record, his boat's original entry. The registration number matched perfectly. Relief swept through the room. These papers weren't just keepsakes. They were supported by something concrete. But the real surprise was hidden in the fine print. An additional notation, brief but unexpected. It suggested that the vessel fell into a special category. In plain terms, it implied the boat carried long-standing access rights in nearby waters. Rights that weren't common anymore. The clerk explained that such notations mattered. They pointed to permissions tied not only to the owner but also to the vessel itself. In practice, that meant those rights could continue even as the boat passed from one person to another. Not guaranteed wealth, not instant fortune, but possibility. That's the power of an archival note. It can shift how you see the entire picture. Here's the thing. A line of letters and numbers turned out to mark value hidden beneath rust and paint. Not just history, but potential. To the family, the meaning transformed. The boat wasn't only sentimental or even just historical. It might be useful, legally recognized, practically important. And as they absorbed that new reality, another question rose naturally in their minds. If it carried such value, why had their grandfather let it sit exposed, corroding by the dock? That puzzle would take them further, into choices that seemed careless at first, but may have been deliberate all along. Why would someone appear to let a valuable boat waste away? That was the question sitting between the family and the neighbor as they looked through the documents. The neighbor leaned in and offered his view. He suspected the grandfather hadn't neglected the boat at all. He believed the weathered planks, the rusted metal, the peeling paint were intentional. a choice made with purpose. In his eyes, the boat's rough shape had been a disguise. The grandfather knew that the boat carried more than memories. It carried rights, tied to the water itself. That kind of value attracts attention the wrong way. People notice. Officials reassess. Neighbors gossip. Rivals get curious. To avoid that, the neighbor suspected, the grandfather allowed the boat to wear its neglect like a mask. By keeping it plain, he kept it hidden. Rust became a shield. Flaking paint became camouflage. Anyone passing by would see only a vessel too old to matter. They would dismiss it with a glance and never guess at the depth of what remained inside. Evidence of this mindset lingered in old family photos. The grandfather was often pictured beside the boat, smiling, calling it names like "that old tub" or "my workhorse." He almost seemed to train those around him to see it as ordinary. He never drew attention to its design or hinted at what it preserved. He steered the conversation to simple things, the day's catch, repairs that never ended, the tired look of its hull. That was the story he wanted told. When you hear it framed that way, his silence feels less like neglect and more like strategy. Maybe it wasn't that he failed to care for the boat. Maybe this was how he cared for it best. Protecting it didn't mean polishing it. Protecting it meant making sure no one else realized what he had. The neighbor's theory made sense in practical ways, too. A valuable-looking vessel could spark envy. It might complicate taxes. It could even invite disputes from others who wanted the same rights. By keeping the boat low, unremarkable, the grandfather reduced those risks. He left only the truth on paper, tucked away with the neighbor, beyond casual reach. Seen this way, the years of rust and neglect take on a different meaning. The boat wasn't abandoned. It was sheltered by its own disguise. Its hidden worth wasn't advertised, but quietly preserved. For a man who thought in terms of tides and seasons, playing the long game like this wasn't out of character. For the family, this shifted the picture of who he was, not just a fisherman, not just an owner, but someone who quietly guarded something precious, even if no one else saw it. His habit of downplaying, of teaching others to overlook what he valued, was itself a kind of protection. That raised a harder challenge now. If you suddenly realize the disguise is no longer needed, how do you know what to do with what lies beneath it? That's the question the family now carried as they looked beyond rust, searching for the boat's true place in the world. The first step in unlocking that mystery was to ask someone who might know. The family reached out to a maritime historian. They sent him photos of the boat, scans of the paperwork, the stamped seals, and even the handwritten notations that lined the margins. At first, he sounded cautious. He told them families often believe their vessels are rare, when most end up being quite ordinary. He'd seen hope turn into disappointment many times before, but as he looked closer, his tone carried more pause. He asked for better images of the unusual seal on the title form, and he examined the registration number with care. He lingered on the notes written in their grandfather's script. Something had caught his attention. The more he studied, the less skeptical he sounded. He pointed out a detail most people overlook, an old notation marking special issuance. It was subtle, but it hinted at long-standing rights attached not to the grandfather personally, but to the vessel itself, rights that seemed to have survived decades of shifting rules. Here's why that matters. Modern fishing rules are strict. Access to certain waters is tightly limited, almost impossible to regain once lost. New permits are rarely, if ever, given out. Yet older registrations, those that still document historic rights, can remain valid. They act like doors left open after newer ones have long since closed. That's why commercial operators take notice. Access to those waters is rare. For businesses, it can mean legal entry into areas where others are excluded. It offers not only opportunity, but advantage. And because they can't apply for new permissions in those regions, their only option is to secure older ones already in existence. Sometimes that means leasing them. Other times, purchasing them outright. The historian explained it plainly. These rights are not common. When they show up, word travels quickly. Collectors of maritime history may admire the vessel itself, but companies quietly prize the invisible permissions. And in recent years, he said, similar rights had fetched unexpectedly high sums, not loose change, far beyond what families often expect, enough to alter the way descendants live. That shift reframed everything. The family had been looking at rust, missing paint, and the cost of repairs. But the true value rested in something that could not corrode. It was written into the documents, preserved in the numbers, carried across time. In that light, the boat was more than metal and wood. It was a key, one that unlocked entry where most doors had shut. The realization left them in silence. What they thought was clutter might instead be rare opportunity. Their grandfather had passed down not only the vessel, but a kind of access almost gone from the modern world. It wasn't just an heirloom. It was leverage. What the family didn't know was that their pause to investigate hadn't gone unnoticed. Outside their circle, someone else was watching the delay with growing interest. Meanwhile, the scrap dealer was still waiting. He had given the family space to decide, but when the expected call never came, he grew curious. Normally, people rushed to get rid of heavy, rusting metal. They wanted quick cash and a cleared dock. Hesitation was unusual. And unusual meant there might be something more. That thought nagged at him until he drove back. When he knocked on the door, he skipped small talk and made another offer, cash on the spot, a little higher this time. "Let me haul it away," he said, keeping it simple. "You won't have to think about it again." It was the kind of pitch that almost always worked. But this family didn't jump at it. Their answer was polite but steady. They needed more time. They weren't ready to let it go. The tone was different now, protective in a way he hadn't heard before. That gave him pause. Something had shifted since his last visit, and it triggered suspicion. He went back to his truck, sat for a moment, then pulled out his phone. A photo of the boat, snapped casually on his first visit, gave him the make and model. He entered the details online, expecting nothing more exciting than spare parts listings or generic ads. What appeared instead caught him off guard. Forums. Entire threads filled with collectors and enthusiasts exchanging notes about vessels from that era. He clicked into one and froze when he saw it. Detailed discussions about the very model parked on the family's dock. People weren't talking about scrap. They were talking with admiration, calling it a sought-after design. They emphasized its builder's reputation. They described its rarity, that only a limited number were made and far fewer had survived into the present. This wasn't a forgotten workboat in their eyes. It was a collectible piece of maritime history. The dealer read post after post. Enthusiasts praised the unique hull style, the craftsmanship, the historical importance. They weren't just looking at it as a vessel to water test. They spoke of it like an artifact, something worth saving and restoring. It was preservation, not disposal, that defined its value. In that moment, his own offer seemed almost absurd. He hadn't simply bid low. He had misunderstood completely. Collectors around the world saw significance in this model, the kind of interest that could drive up value well beyond what a scrapyard would ever produce. A realization settled in. The family's hesitation suddenly made sense. They weren't clinging to lost sentiment or dragging their feet. They had uncovered something real, something the wider community recognized too. This wasn't just their story anymore. The dealer put down his phone and started his engine. He didn't plan to make another offer. Trying to compete with historical importance wasn't his business. The boat was no longer just an opportunity for him. It was something larger, something meant to stay in hands that understood its weight. But as the boat's true significance became clearer, word began to spread beyond collectors' forums and quiet family circles. And once it reached new ears, it raised a different kind of tension altogether. The new owners of the dock property didn't stay quiet for long. They had assumed they were buying land, water access, and the dock structure, with the battered old boat only an afterthought. When news surfaced about its potential value, their perspective shifted quickly. Suddenly, what once looked like junk started to look like opportunity. They contacted the family again. This time, the tone was firmer. They claimed the boat was part of what they had purchased. They mentioned previous conversations where everything on the property had supposedly been included. The implication was clear. They believed it was theirs. And if the family disagreed, they left the possibility of legal action hovering in the air. For a family already stretched thin by months of grief and uncertainty, this was a heavy blow. Just as they had started to feel hope, tension returned. Papers and documents were gathered, and an attorney was consulted. They spread out the sale agreement, the property deed, and the vessel's separate records on the table for review. The attorney looked them over carefully. The deed was precise in what it listed: land and waterfront boundaries, the physical dock. But nowhere on the real estate documents was the boat mentioned. At the same time, the vessel carried its own paperwork, registration forms, and a title naming the grandfather as owner. Those two threads together, no listing on the property deed, but clear title in the grandfather's name, pointed strongly toward the boat being separate personal property, more like a vehicle than part of the real estate. The family asked about the buyer's claim that everything on the property counted. The attorney explained it this way: verbal understandings are riskier than signed, itemized records. What carries weight in disputes are dated forms and titles, not memories of conversations. And in this case, the written record strengthened the family's claim. That message, passed from one lawyer to another, gave the new owners a sobering choice. Yes, they could press ahead, file a suit, and test their argument in court. But the paper trails suggested the odds were against them. A dispute could mean time, fees, and embarrassment if a ruling went public. Facing that reality, they reconsidered. Instead of escalating, the new owners quietly stepped back. No courtroom, no judge, no drawn-out spectacle. Just a decision that continuing wasn't worth the fight. They let go of their claim. What could have been a heated legal showdown became a short conversation that fizzled out as quickly as it sparked. For the family, the experience carried a lesson. The grandfather's steady habit of keeping documents, of organizing records with care, had become a shield. Those forms outlived him, but they still spoke with authority. They closed the door on what might have been a bitter conflict before it even really opened. And that resolution left the family together at the table, relieved, but also aware that victory on paper was only part of the story. With the boat now unquestionably theirs, new questions rose inside the home. This time, the struggle wasn't about property lines. It was about how siblings, still grieving, would choose to live with the legacy that had suddenly been restored. Money changes how families see things, but so does understanding what a true legacy means. Around the same table where arguments once circled about scrap costs and hauling fees, the siblings now faced a different question. How should they handle what had been uncovered, not just in terms of property, but as a story handed down? The room carried tension, but not the sharp kind from before. Instead of clashing over clutter or deadlines, the discussion split along a single clear divide. Some argued for an immediate sale. To them, turning rights into money was the simplest path forward. A one-time payout could wipe debts, support children, and ease the constant stress of bills. It was practical, direct, and tempting. The others leaned toward stewardship. They wanted to preserve the boat and the meaning tied to it, not as something polished for display, but as a physical reminder of their grandfather's careful choices. Selling the rights, they argued, might feel like losing him quietly, in a new way. Keeping part of the legacy intact meant carrying history forward rather than cashing it in. For once, both sides listened. No one pressed for haste. The urgency that had ruled earlier decisions was no longer present. What mattered now was balance, honoring their grandfather while also respecting their own futures. To make sense of the options, they sought advice. From a financial standpoint, they learned a lump sum would be powerful but short-lived. Taxes and expenses would wear it down quickly. Leasing, however, could produce a steady income stream over years, a slower gain, but one that provided stability. They also spoke with a conservator who explained how a restoration could be focused, preserving character without pretending to erase age. He suggested stabilizing the structure so it wouldn't collapse, while leaving visible the wear that told its story. Information cleared the fog. The siblings no longer debated in abstractions. They had side-by-side paths, an instant exit, or a careful plan that stretched forward in time. And out of that knowledge, they chose a middle ground. The family agreed to lease the fishing rights under strict conditions. The contract included protective terms. For example, it specified the rights could not be quietly sold off to others. That safeguard helped them feel they weren't giving away what their grandfather had worked to preserve. At the same time, the steady payments gave them something they hadn't had in years: breathing room. Day-to-day life shifted. Bills no longer loomed quite so large. Planning for the future felt possible in a way it hadn't before. They also chose to stabilize the boat. No attempt to make it new. No attempt to erase its battered exterior. Instead, they preserved it as a monument. Some rust was kept, some decay deliberately left visible, because those marks told the truth of its journey. Its rough presence by the water became both reminder and anchor. The change in the family was clear. Where once there had been resignation, now there was purpose. Their grandfather's gift wasn't only preserved on paper, it was active, shaping choices, creating unity where there had been division. But with every decision made, one realization lingered. For all the planning and steady talk that followed, it became impossible to ignore just how close they had come to losing it all in a single, hurried choice. What was almost lost came down to seconds. Outside, the scrap truck sat rumbling at the dock. The driver had already thrown the winch line over the bow and tightened it, dragging the hull forward with a screech of strained metal. Inside the kitchen, one sibling stood frozen, staring out the window. Another put a hand on the door handle, ready to give the signal. That single gesture would have been enough. One nod, one wave, and the boat would have been gone. It's hard to explain the pull of that moment unless you felt it yourself. The mix of exhaustion and relief that tempts you to walk away rather than push back. One family member admitted later that they wanted to surrender, to let the noise outside carry the burden off, to see the problem vanish, even if it meant erasing what they didn't yet understand. And that's how close the line was. A few more seconds and the boat would have left on the back of that flatbed, headed toward destruction, as if it were no more than scrap metal. Along with it, the hidden rights, the builder's legacy, and the story of deliberate protection would have slipped into silence. That thought alone makes the near miss more dramatic than any courtroom scene or debate could. The moment broke not because of a decision inside the house, but because of a quiet interruption. The neighbor arrived, his vehicle rolling into the drive at the exact time the driver looked back for a signal. The pause stretched long enough for hesitation to harden into resistance. Instead of waving the truck forward, the family member at the door turned away. The one at the window stepped back. Curiosity replaced resignation. And in that vacuum, history had its chance to survive. Today, they speak about it often, not just as family nostalgia, but as a reminder of how fragile legacies can be. The story comes up at holidays, at summer cookouts, whenever someone asks why they still keep the boat. The answer is told as a lesson, that almost losing something can make you see it more clearly than ever having it secure. Patience gave them back more than a vessel. It gave them perspective. But this isn't just their story. It's a common human trap, calling something useless before you've really looked. We live in a culture that prizes clearing out, letting go, moving faster with less. Often, that works. Sometimes, it just leaves space. But once in a while, it erases meaning you never realized was there. A moment's pause can be the difference between discarding history and preserving it. So here's the question worth carrying with you. In your own life, is there something sitting in the corner, gathering dust, that might hold more than it shows? Not just clutter, not just junk. Maybe a key to stories you haven't uncovered yet. The family now faced that very problem. They had saved the boat, yes, but saving is not the same as caring. Once the legal dust settled, they had to turn to a harder, practical question. What do you do with something that almost became scrap? Preservation isn't about saving an object in perfect condition. It's about deciding what deserves to last and in what state. For the family, this became their work once the papers had secured their claim. The boat needed attention, but not in the simple sense of sanding it smooth and repainting it bright. It needed care with intent. They brought in specialists to examine it. A marine surveyor tapped along the hull, noting where the steel had weakened. A conservator ran a hand across the softened planks and checked the integrity of the frame. Their advice was straightforward. The boat could not be made new without losing too much, but it could be preserved if they made careful choices about what to repair and what to leave as it was. Years on the water had left their mark. Rust spread through parts of the hull. Deckboards sagged, the engine sat frozen in place. Much was damaged, and some parts needed replacement just to keep the structure sound. That would keep the boat from collapsing further. But other signs of age, the surface rust, the streaks along the sides, the places where paint had faded back to bare wood, were not flaws to erase. They were evidence worth keeping. This is where the art of preservation comes in. Instead of wiping away time, the goal becomes stabilizing it. Fix what threatens to break, and leave the rest as testimony. You stop the rust from spreading, but you don't polish away every scar. You repair weakened boards, but you keep the ones that still hold, even if they show long seasons of wear. In essence, it's like saving an old book. Replace the missing cover so it survives, but let the pages stay wrinkled with years of reading. The family gathered to talk this through with the experts. They studied examples of other restorations. Some ships had been brought back to look like they had just been launched, gleaming and complete. Others had been locked in place, exactly as they were found, fragile but authentic. Neither extreme felt right. To them, the balance lay in the middle, a sound structure that still carried its weathered truth. So the decision was made. They would restore it partially. Structural repairs first, enough to keep it from falling apart, but much of the outside would remain untouched. The rust streaks down the sides would stay. The deck would show its worn spots. The faded lettering would not be scrubbed into brightness. This felt in line with what the grandfather himself once practiced. He kept the boat looking ordinary, disguising its deeper worth. By preserving what looked like neglect, the family felt they were honoring his intent. They weren't covering over his choices, but continuing them. The disguise no longer had to protect the boat, but it still stood as witness to his strategy. The work ahead was costly in labor and time, yet it carried new meaning. It wasn't just fixing decay. It was transforming damage into memory, scars into stories. In that act, the boat became more than a vessel rescued from disposal. It became a visible link backward and forward at once. And when the repairs began, it wasn't only adults who paid attention. Younger eyes soon turned to the dock as well, seeing in the patched hull not junk, but the start of a story they had never fully heard before. For the grandchildren, the boat had always been scenery. They knew it as Grandpa's old boat, something he loved without ever explaining why. It sat in photos, showed up in stories told in fragments, but never carried full explanation. This time was different. This time, it came with the whole story threaded together. Their parents, aunts, and uncles gathered them by the hull and began to talk. They explained how close it had come to being taken away. They described the rust not as simple decay, but as an intentional disguise. They shared the neighbor's role, the envelope of papers, the last-minute rescue. The children listened closely, their eyes shifting between the adults and the boat itself. And as they listened, their view of it started to change. Once they thought of it as unsafe and tired, something to be careful near. Now they learned about choice, about hiding value in plain sight. They realized their great-grandfather might have allowed it to look worthless in order to protect its real worth. That idea unsettled them at first, but also made them pay attention. Protection, they learned, doesn't always mean polish. Sometimes it means letting something wear its mask. One of the younger ones reached out to touch the boat. Their hand landed on a strip of rust, and instead of pulling back, they held it there. It wasn't pity anymore. It was recognition. The act carried weight. The boat stood no longer as a neglected object, but as a living reminder, something to treat with respect rather than avoidance. Questions came quickly after that. Why hadn't their grandfather said more? Why did the neighbor hold on to the papers for so long? How could numbers printed on a form carry such power? Each answer deepened the story for them. What had seemed like random details of adulthood now formed a lesson about foresight, quiet friendship, and how layers of truth hide inside family history. Their inheritance wasn't just tied to a boat or rights written on paper. It was the story woven into those things, a reminder to keep looking past the surface. The family decided that this story could never risk being lost again. The paper documents themselves were safe, for now, but paper fades, water damages, accidents happen. So they acted. Every page was carefully scanned, the vessel's ownership certificate, the registration, the grandfather's handwritten notes. They photographed the boat in its present state and gathered every older picture from family albums. They even recorded the neighbor telling his memory of the moment, his voice explaining what words on pages couldn't. From those steps, they built a digital record. Multiple secure copies were made, and each was given to trusted family members. Instructions were written down, so nobody would be left wondering what file mattered most. For them, it wasn't just protection. It was insurance that the story would last longer than any one envelope or bookshelf. And here's where you might pause for yourself. Think about one old box you've meant to open, one stack of papers in a drawer. Scan them, back them up, pass a copy along, because once a memory is gone, stories are hard to rebuild. But with a little effort, you can keep them safe for those who come after you. This act sealed the legacy. It proved they understood the value wasn't only in rights or history, but in knowing and keeping the story connected to both. By securing it digitally and physically, they gave their children and their children's children a starting place. Not just anecdote, not just faded memory, but a permanent record. And yet, while the family preserved the story, one question stayed. Just how rare was this boat really? That answer would come soon, and it would reshape everything they thought they knew about its worth. How rare can one vessel be? That was the next question the historian sought to answer. He dug back into shipyard notes and early registration logs, scanning for clues. And soon it became clear. This boat wasn't just uncommon. Records suggested that only a small number of its kind had ever been produced, and even fewer had made it through the decades intact. Most of the original builds had long since vanished. Some went under in storms. Others were stripped for parts or taken apart once their engines failed. A few had been rebuilt so heavily that little of their original form remained. Survivors were scarce, and most carried no trace of their original fishing rights anymore. But this one stood apart. According to the documents, it was the rare outlier that never lost its original permissions. While other boats had let licenses lapse or detached them from the vessel through sales, this one kept the pieces together. Hull, history, right of use. That union is what made the historian pause. It wasn't simply a relic. It was a whole story still intact. Once word of that spread beyond the family, reactions changed. Collectors and appraisers who had at first spoken cautiously now described it with far more weight. They said it wasn't about scrap metal or even just a well-built hull anymore. It was about the rarity of holding something nearly unmatched, a vessel with its identity still whole. Some even said boats with this kind of surviving legacy were almost never seen on the market. Design added to that value. As the historian pointed out, for its time, the boat carried features ahead of its peers. The hull form was built for stability in rough water, a shape that echoed through later generations of working boats. The deck arrangement made tasks like setting and hauling nets easier, ideas that slowly influenced boats that followed. Whether the grandfather knew the blueprint's influence or not, He had been working with something that turned out to be quietly significant in its own right. That's what makes this distinction important. You can't just rebuild or reorder something like this today. You could repair a hull, yes. You could even fabricate a copy. But what you can't recreate is the lineage tied to it. You can't write its history again, and you certainly can't retrieve registration rights once they've been lost. The uniqueness isn't only about its scarcity. It's about which parts of its story survived uninterrupted. The family began to see themselves differently through that knowledge. No longer just beneficiaries of a lucky find, they were caretakers. Holding on to a vessel this rare meant responsibilities greater than selling or storing. To let it slip would erase something that could not return. That sense of stewardship grew with each conversation. They moved from worrying over cost and upkeep to thinking in terms of guardianship. They spoke less about profit and more about preservation. The rarity had shifted not just the object's value, but their own role in the story. And as this realization settled, their focus began to move in a new direction, toward the people around them, and what the unfolding journey already meant for their bonds with one another. The family decided it was time to mark what had been saved in a way that money couldn't capture. They hosted a gathering at the dock, not as a celebration of ownership, but as a thank you. Chairs lined the water, food was set out, and people who had been a part of the journey were invited. The boat itself stood nearby, partially restored, but the true center of the day was the neighbor, the man whose envelope had carried the turning point. When they called to ask him to attend as guest of honor, he hesitated. He said he hadn't done anything unusual. In his words, he had only returned what already belonged to them. To him, it was simple decency, not something that earned spotlight. He tried to decline quietly, but the family pressed. They told him it wasn't just about the papers. It was about memory, about loyalty, about stepping in when it counted. They wanted him there because he belonged in the story just as much as the boat. When he arrived at the gathering, they handed him a gift they had prepared. An old photograph, enlarged and framed. Him and their grandfather, much younger, standing on that very deck, holding a catch in the sun. The image caught him off guard. For a moment, he only gazed at it. A shift crossed his face. What had been reluctance softened into something more open. His eyes watered, yet he didn't need to say anything. Everyone could see what it meant to him. That picture cracked open a space that silence had sealed for years. The neighbor began to share stories many of the younger faces had never heard. He spoke of storms suddenly rising, the two men riding them out with steady hands. He recalled small jokes, repeated so often they became unspoken shorthand. He described the quiet strength of working side by side without needing to talk. Each account gave the grandchildren a version of their grandfather they never really knew. Around him, the family listened closely. Some wiped tears, some smiled. For them, this was the real inheritance, not just the vessel or even the fishing rights, but the laughter, the struggles, the companionship woven into their grandfather's life. It felt less like a memorial and more like a continuation. The neighbor wasn't retelling history for himself. He was passing it on, letting the next generation carry it forward. The boat stood silently through it all, but in that moment, it had already changed its role. What had once seemed like a source of burden now served as a bridge. It connected lives, between past and present, between the neighbor and the family, between memory and discovery. It gave the grandchildren something more than a story to read. It gave them a voice they could hear. That gathering reshaped how everyone there measured value. Yes, the ledger showed rights and appraisal figures, but this exchange of stories, the healing of distance, the weaving together of relationships, that was the richer gift. The financial security mattered, but the emotional payoff proved just as vital. Their true inheritance wasn't one they could sell. It was one they could share. What the day revealed was simple. The things we save aren't always objects. Sometimes what's preserved is the bond itself, and that bond becomes the story. And once you see that, it makes you ask how often we misjudge the things around us by surface appearances alone. Lessons in looking closer aren't abstract. They show up right in front of you, in the small things you almost dismiss. For this family, it was an old boat with peeling paint. For you, it might be something tucked in a corner, easy to overlook until curiosity forces a pause. That pause is often where the story hides. Most of us move fast. Life rewards quick choices, clearing clutter, upgrading instead of repairing. Time feels scarce, and discarding the old seems efficient. But efficiency can erase more than mess. It can silence pieces of history that only make sense if someone takes the time to ask why they were kept. The worn, the scratched, the documents with faded ink. Those are often the places where meaning waits quietly. History doesn't always wear labels. It rests unnoticed in attics, garages, and tool sheds. It hangs in barns or gathers dust in drawers. At a glance, it looks like nothing but clutter. But if you stop for a moment, you start to see details that shift the whole picture. A slip of handwriting in the margin, a mark from a hand long gone, an object that doesn't fit the logic of being kept unless it mattered to someone. Here's a practical way to think about it. Before you toss that old box, ask one question. Why was this kept? Simple as that. Maybe the answer is trivial. It wasn't thrown away because no one bothered. But every so often, asking leads somewhere else. Sometimes it uncovers the clue to an entire past decision. And sometimes, as with this family, that one box opens the door to a bigger story. Think of your own house. The stack of papers you've postponed sorting through. The tools in a shed that haven't been lifted in years. The furniture that feels out of date but never leaves. Each takes up space, but each also holds a reason. If you push past the surface, if you ask not just what it is, but why it was saved, you begin to see a trail. And trails often lead to stories, sometimes even to value you didn't realize was there. This family's lesson works on two levels. There's the practical side. By looking closer, you may discover not just memories, but assets. Something overlooked can alter your financial landscape. It can make life more stable, as this discovery did for them. But there's also the emotional side, which often matters just as much. Looking closer forges connection. It bridges gaps between generations. It explains the character of those who came before you and challenges assumptions about what they left behind. That's the part that can't be measured. The true inheritance here wasn't just financial benefit. It was identity. The realization that their grandfather hadn't been neglectful at all, but protective in a way no one first understood. It was the mended trust with a neighbor whose care outlasted decades. It was watching younger voices hear stories that now belong to them as much as the boat ever did. So what's the call to action? It isn't to cling to every object. It's to slow down when the impulse is to rush. And it's to look beneath the surface before deciding what something's worth. Because slowing down gives you the chance to keep what matters. And looking deeper helps you see the story even when it's hiding in rough edges and rust. And sometimes, those stories endure longer than the objects themselves. From there, the family's journey pointed to one last truth. Some legacies can stand against time, against rust, against the heavy weight of assumption.
So here we are at the end with one clear takeaway.
Sometimes, the most ordinary thing can hold the most unexpected truth. This boat was almost dismissed as clutter, yet it became a turning point because someone chose to look closer. Now I'd like to hear from you. Think of one thing you've found while going through old family boxes, papers, or keepsakes. Share it in the comments. It might seem small, but those finds often carry more than they first show. Subscribe if you'd like more stories where everyday objects uncover surprising pasts. And thank you for taking the time to listen.